Okay, so today we're going to be looking at epistemology. So what, according to Warburton, what is the precise relationship between what I think I see and what is actually in front of me? Or actually, Warburton doesn't answer these questions, but these are the questions that we are going to be looking at. Can I ever be sure about what is out there? Could I be dreaming? And do objects continue to exist when nobody is observing them? Are you dreaming right now?
Right now.
Yeah. Or are you awake?
Awake.
Are you dreaming right now or are you awake?
Week.
How do you know?
Because I can clearly think about something.
You can clearly think. Some people have dreams, and in their dreams they're so clear that they talk like, it feels like this. It feels exactly like this. Have you ever had that kind of dream before? Have you ever had a dream that was so clear that it seemed real? Another question is, how do you know that if you go away from the classroom, will this desk still be here when you leave? If nobody moves it, nobody steals it, will this desk right here, if you leave the classroom,
No.
it will not be here. Nobody steals it, nobody moves it.
But we don't know if the desk will disappear or not.
Okay.
Because you didn't see the desk anymore.
Okay, you don't see the desk, so do you believe that everything disappears when you don't see it? Okay, so there's no object permanence, in other words. Things can disappear and then reappear. Do you so your position then, do you remember the name that in the Warburton reading that he gives for this position? In the Warburton reading, there's a name for this kind of thinking, that objects do not stay, well, they disappear if we're not perceiving them. So perceiving includes touch, because you could close your eyes and then, the object is still there if you're touching it. So it includes touch, smell, taste, and sight. And yeah, those basic senses, I guess you could say, yeah, did I say taste? Taste as well. That those basic senses are perceiving. We call these perceiving senses, and these senses are what determine that things exist or they don't exist. And so idealism is actually the term we're looking for. Idealism assumes that things disappear if nobody is perceiving them. Okay? But, sorry, what were you saying?
Idealism.
Idealism, yeah. So your position on this is idealism. Do you know what the name of your position is? Because you said they don't disappear.
Yes. I don't know the word.
Yeah, well, there were several versions of the same thing. So there's several versions of this theory, and the name of it is realism. But realism. If you believe that things don't disappear when you don't see them or perceive them, when you leave the classroom, the desk is still here. This is called realism. Okay. If you believe that they disappear, what's that? Yeah, he's idealism on this one. So, but there's different kinds of realism, and we're going to look at each one of those. So the first one that Warburton talks about is called common sense realism. Now, I don't know, were you guys able to watch the videos on the videos from Richard Candida Smith from UC Berkeley on pragmatism, and Charles Sanders Peirce? Were those difficult? You need to watch those. They're difficult lectures, but you need to watch them. They'll be very helpful for you, especially for the final exam. So you need to watch them. Now, common sense pragmatism was actually a reaction to common sense realism in a lot of ways. And actually a lot of theories, 19th and 20th century theories, so the important theories that have in some ways shaped our world today, were reactions against common sense realism. Because common sense realism was something that was developed mostly in Scotland at the end of the 18th century. So it assumes that there is a world of physical objects which we can learn about directly through our five senses. Okay? Sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste, right? Physical objects exist whether or not we are perceiving them. As I said, objects are more or less as they appear, and our senses are a reliable source for understanding the world. Do you agree or disagree with these concepts? Okay, so you might be more of what's called which we will get to, mental representation or representational realism. So here's some objections to common sense realism. The illusion argument. Do you guys remember what this illusion argument is? Have you ever thought that you were waving to a friend and you realize that later that nope, that's not your friend. This is a totally different stranger that you've never met. Have you ever done that before?
No.
You've never done that before?
But I sometimes think something happened. It's already happened before.
Before. And does it happen later?
Yes.
Okay, we call that déjà vu. Déjà vu, yeah. Déjà vu comes from the French for to see it again. Vu means to see. Déjà means again, or yeah. So what it means is to have seen it again. So you saw it one time in your mind, and then it happens. Okay, so what happens when you take a stick and it's underwater? You put it underwater and you're looking at the stick from above the water, and you look under the water and maybe it's moving. You move it a little bit and it looks like it's like bent. It's like kind of bent, you know. So when you're looking at that, is the stick actually bent or is it still straight? When you're looking, it's actually really straight, but it looks bent. So our perception of the stick is wrong, right? So what I'm trying to say is that these are different. The illusion argument has to do with different problems that happen when we just rely on our senses, that we don't always perceive things correctly. What about the moon? If the moon is on the horizon, you know, it's low in the sky, it's not directly above us, is it bigger or smaller?
Same.
It's actually the same. But what does it look like when it's on the horizon?
Smaller.
No, it usually looks bigger. When it's lower down, it looks bigger. When it's higher up, it looks smaller. Okay, at least to me. I think to everyone. But the fact is, it doesn't actually change. There's no actual change. So again, our senses are fooling us. We're getting fooled by our own perception. Some people think certain dresses are red when they're black. Other people think a black dress is red. Or you know, I guess that's not exactly true, but it can happen depending on how the light is put on the object. So these are the problems. This is all called the illusion argument, that we don't see things always correctly, and not just sight, but we don't smell things correctly, we don't taste things correctly all the time, we don't feel things correctly all the time, and so this is the illusion argument. So but the thing is, with the criticisms that you can bring to the illusion argument, is that can you really doubt that you're sitting at this desk right now? Can you really doubt that? Is it possible to really doubt that? Can you really doubt, for you guys that are here in China, that you're really in China? Can you think, maybe I'm actually in America right now and I'm just dreaming that I'm in China? Is it possible you're just dreaming you're in China? You're not really in China.
I'm really in China.
You're really in China, right? So it seems odd. Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
But people cannot sure whether we are dreaming or not.
Yeah, you might not be able to be sure, but it seems like it's really hard to doubt specific things, right? So this is an argument against the illusion argument. It's not a conclusive argument, but just in general, it's really hard to doubt certain facts that we have. It doesn't mean that we can't get things wrong from time to time. Like, we can think that the moon is bigger when it's on the horizon than above us, and then later find out through science that it's actually the same size. But certain things don't seem to really change. So it seems that sometimes, at least, our senses are very reliable. And there are some uncontroversial cases, according to Warburton, of knowing through which we learn the concept of knowledge. It is only because we have this background of cases of knowledge that we can doubt other beliefs. Without these uncontroversial cases, we would have no concept of knowledge at all, and nothing with which to contrast more doubtful beliefs. So having some solid beliefs makes it possible to have beliefs that you doubt. Right? You have to have something you believe in order to doubt. You can't just doubt everything. So the skeptic's reply to this, though, is like what Lydia brought up. But how do you know that you aren't dreaming? Isn't there anything about experience of dreaming which can conclusively distinguish it from that of waking? Is there anything you guys you remember from the reading, or you can bring up where you can say this is when a dream happens and this isn't when a dream happens? Like, so this shows that this is a dream, and this shows this is not a dream. In dreaming, often things are too good to be true. So I can jump off of a building in a dream, but I don't actually get the consequences of death. Or, not that I want to try that to see, but
you didn't feel any pain.
Yeah, you don't feel any pain. They're too good to be true. Or I won't make any mistakes. Like, at least when I'm awake, I can make some mistakes when I'm speaking, and I have to correct myself. Also, I think another difference in dreams is that you have some real clear incoherent things happen. Usually there's always something that happens that doesn't make any sense at all. And you can usually spot those things at some point. Have you ever seen the movie Inception?
Inception?
Yeah. Leonardo DiCaprio. It talks about this. So basically, there's like a whole, you can get into a world of dreams, and you can join other people in your dream. It's very interesting. This is a very philosophical movie about dreams and perception. That somehow they can join up in the dreams, and then they can do certain things in the dream. And it's kind of like this thing about being able to control your dream and do what you want.
Right.
But sometimes they can't know if they're in a dream or not, also.
Yeah.
They don't know. And then you go in a dream within a dream. So you have a dream, and you're sleeping, and then in your dream, you're walking around like we are now, and then, okay, now I'm gonna sleep here in the dream. And then you have another dream in that dream. And then you do something in that dream. And then you can keep going. You can keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. So it's a really interesting. So you have to wake up from each dream to get back to this. And then you don't know if you got back to the original or if you're still in the dream. You don't know. So they have this different, it's the whole problem, and there's some crime going on, obviously. So they have to solve the problem and the crime in this thing. So anyway, it's a good movie. One reply to this skeptical comment is we can't always be dreaming. Okay? You cannot possibly always be dreaming, because the concept of dreaming requires that there's some awake time that you can compare with it, right? That doesn't mean that it solves the problem of, like, we could still be in the matrix, right? And our bodies maybe are actually somewhere else, and we're in a virtual world. It doesn't solve that problem. But you can't, for dreaming, it doesn't seem logical. You can't always be dreaming. If you're always dreaming, that means that dreaming is the reality, and awake is a dream. So it's the same thing. You have to have an on-off switch. So there has to be something to compare to. So, but the skeptic isn't necessarily arguing this. When somebody says, how do we know if we're dreaming right now? They're saying that there's moments you might be dreaming. So what the skeptic is arguing is that we can't know whether we're dreaming or not. So here's a reply to the skeptics. Dreams are different. And we just said this, that there's hazy events, bizarre events, disjointed, and they're impressionistic. But you have to be able to distinguish between being awake and asleep for the dream argument to work. You can only ask if you are dreaming if you're awake. So we talked about this already. However, and you mentioned this, I think, Yuan, is that some people's dreams are called lucid dreams. They're dreaming, but they're actually aware that they're dreaming. So they're actually asleep and they're dreaming, but they say, I'm dreaming right now. I've actually had this experience before. Have you ever had this experience where you're dreaming and you're like, I'm actually dreaming right now, but I'm going to stay asleep because this is fun. Like maybe you can fly around, maybe you can do some things that you normally can't do. It's like Grand Theft Auto or something, and so you might as well just live it up. You're in your dream. So I don't know. Have you guys experienced that before? Where you're dreaming.
Yeah.
Okay, but you stay dreaming. But that's kind of like controlling the dream too.
Yeah.
But you don't know what you're talking about also is that you want the ability to always control your dream, right? Because I think, have you ever had a dream where you felt like you were in control of the dream? You knew you're dreaming. You're like, okay, now I'm going to do whatever I want. There's also more skepticism. How do we know we're not on some mind-altering drug? Maybe somebody, while we were sleeping, put us in a drug. So when we woke up, we're still in the drug. And then there's this thing called brain in a jar. You know the brain in a jar? So you cannot argue. So it's you think that you actually have a body and you think you're actually interacting in the world, but brain in the jar is your brain is actually reliability of memory. We don't always have a good memory, but if we didn't have memory at all, it would be totally impossible to communicate. Like have you ever talked to somebody who has like Alzheimer's disease? Alzheimer's, they forget. Basically, it's like for old people, they forget everything, right? Like so they cannot So what if I was like? It's really hard to have a conversation with somebody like that. So it's like it's like I keep saying, oh, hi, what is your name? And then 1 second, hi, what is your name?
Still tired.
Yeah. Right? So but the problem is that you can't, there's no communication, right? No more communication. We have to have memory. So even to have as much of a conversation as we've had today, we've had to have some sort of memory in order to do that. So if skeptics question logic, then they're undermining the questioning they are doing. So at some point, if you keep questioning about is logic even logical, then how are you even able to question logic? It's similar to the question at the beginning of the course we talked about with philosophy. If you don't want to philosophize, well, then you've already made an argument about philosophy, that you don't want to philosophize, and you've actually committed yourself to philosophy just by saying, I don't think philosophy is good. You're actually making a philosophical statement. It's the same thing with logic. If you say that there's no logic, which is a skeptical position, then you're making a kind of a claim based on some sort of logic. And so you undermine your own ability to do that. So it shows that skepticism has a limit. So skepticism is great. It helps us question the fundamental basics of everything, question ourselves, but it's limited. Ultimately, it can't give all the answers. Well, it's not even supposed to. The whole point of skepticism is to question our answers to begin with. We have to look elsewhere. Okay, do you guys remember reading about the cogito? The cogito ergo sum. That's what Descartes said. He said, I think, therefore I am. I can be certain I exist even if my brain is in a jar. So maybe everything is fake, but at least I can say I exist. And the reason I can say I exist is because I can think. As long as I can think, then I know that I exist. Okay, so in other words, there would be nothing, I couldn't deceive myself. I couldn't trick myself into believing that this world existed if I didn't think, right? If I wasn't able to think. So at least there is some sort of existence, even if it's a brain in a jar existence. However, this can be also criticized. And this was, we looked at A.J. Ayer before, and he's the emotivism in ethics. He brought up those questions that are a meta-ethical position. All it proves is that I exist. So this is a very limited thing. But A.J. Ayer's criticism is, I think, actually, therefore I have thoughts. It doesn't mean I exist. It just means that there are thoughts, that thoughts exist. So we still don't know if I exist or not. We know that there are thoughts, and the thinking that I'm doing is producing these thoughts, but that's all we know. So so in other words, we don't have a conclusion. Based on common sense realism, we can't actually address all of these skeptical questions. We can sort of address them, but common sense realism sort of fails, which is one of the reasons why people like Charles Sanders Peirce came up with a pragmatic theory. Argument showed that the assumption that the senses almost always give us true information about nature of the external world is implausible. The fact that our senses can so easily mislead us should be enough to reduce our confidence in the view that objects really are as they seem to us. So we should have a little bit of skepticism towards this common sense perspective. Here's another perspective called representative realism, and that is that the inner representation of external world. So it's not just things are as they seem, they are, but really what we're interacting with is a mental picture. And I like how he uses the term, or he uses kind of an example of this, is that you're sitting in a theater and you're watching a movie of the world. The world is out there. We know it's out there somehow, but really what we're interacting with are pictures in our mind of the world. So if you see a seagull, you're only seeing the mental representation of a seagull. You're not actually seeing the seagull. So this is a response to the illusion argument. A red dress may look black, but redness is not independent of the perceiver. It's part of the perceiver, this concept of redness. So what are primary and secondary qualities in this schema of representative realism? And this came through John Locke. It's almost like making a distinction between objective and subjective truth. Similar, but a little bit different. We'll go through these. So like what you said, primary qualities are qualities which an object actually has, regardless of the conditions that it's being perceived. Because a big part of realism is that objects exist whether or not we perceive them, or whether it's being perceived at all. Size, shape, and movement are examples of this. They don't change based on our perception. They just are. They're facts. But our mental representation closely resembles the qualities in these objects. So when you're looking at Yuxuan and I, if we are exactly 184 centimeters, you will think that we look pretty much the same height. Sometimes you can get it wrong. You can think two different people are two different heights, even though they're technically the same height. But you generally will get pretty close. You'll think, if you see two people that are 184 centimeters or three people, you'll put them all in that category. If you're asked to divide things up, you'll get that fairly right. However, the texture of an object, which is determined by its primary qualities, gives rise to our experience of secondary qualities. And I think texture is not just the texture like in terms of the feeling of the object, but are things that would be these secondary features that kind of come out of the primary features. So you could say texture-wise that Yuxuan and I have different facial features. So those are different textures somehow. And so you're able to determine the difference between us, not just based on the size and shape or the movement of our bodies, but that there's actual physical features that you're able to interact with and be able to make a conclusion. So these secondary qualities don't resemble the actual objects, rather are part of the product of the kind of sensory system we happen to have. So all of these other secondary features that you see, that you decide, this is Jesse and this is Yuxuan, we make this difference. The way you're able to make that difference is because in your own mind, you're actually making these secondary features possible. This includes color, taste, and smell. And our mental image of the shape of the redness resembles the real shape of the red dress, but the redness of the dress does not resemble actual qualities of the red dress. So primary and secondary qualities are correlate with each other somewhat, I wrote this wrong. Primary and secondary qualities correlate somewhat to the concepts of primary and subjective truth, and that's a respective statement. So objective truth and primary qualities are somewhat the same. Subjective truth and secondary qualities are somewhat the same. Okay? So now, here are some criticisms of representative realism. Perceiver in the head. So what the idea behind this is that there could be an infinite number of these little things, these little guys, these little people. They're called homunculus, okay? Or if there's plural of them, homunculi. All of these homunculi are actually in our heads, and they're doing the perceiving. So there's one homunculi in our head that perceives things, and then he would need then somebody to be perceiving for him, right? So then there would be another homunculi inside of that, or homunculus inside of that homunculus, and then there's another homunculus inside of that homunculus, and then there's another homunculus inside of that homunculus, and it keeps on going on and on and on. So the real world is then unknowable, and all interpretation is indirect through a mental representation. So it's like being trapped in a private cinema. So whereas realism, or common sense realism, says there's actually, the real world you're interacting with, the representative realism says you're only in the theater. You can't get out of the theater and actually interact with the world. So it seems a little ridiculous. The whole homunculi thing seems ridiculous. I think that would be implausible. So that's a good argument against it. Okay, idealism. So idealism is that the actual world doesn't actually exist, and it doesn't exist, and it's unknowable. We can't actually know the real world. When we are not perceiving through the senses, things don't exist. We mentioned this before with UN. Bishop George Berkeley, whom the University of Berkeley is named after, actually, and the city of Berkeley is named after, actually held this position. For Berkeley, the reason things continue to exist when we don't perceive them is because God is always perceiving them. So actually things are always in existence. He wouldn't say that things just disappear when we don't see them, because he believed that God is perceiving them. So there's something that's still perceiving them at all times. But if there was no God perceiving them and there was no us perceiving them, then everything would just disappear when we don't perceive them. Here's some criticisms of idealism. Here's the hallucination and dreams problem. Actually, idealism explains these better. Repeated patterns lead to predictability. Dreams and hallucinations don't have this predictability. So that would be one problem. Even though you can say, well, okay, so, we have a problem of not being able to say that we know that things exist when we don't see them. We can say that there's at least some predictability. I go out of the room and I come back. The object returns. Okay? So this is a very consistent actual behavior that we can use. So you don't really need to worry about the hallucination and dream if you have idealistic perspective. Does that make sense, Yuan?
Yeah.
Because it's almost like you're in a dream already, right? But also this whole thing of predictability. Because see, for common sense realism, it doesn't matter, or the other representative realism, it doesn't matter if you're saying it's predictable. It doesn't help me explain that this isn't a dream. Okay? But for idealism, if there's a predictability, then it's like, well, whether it's a dream or not, you can predict that things will always come back when I perceive them. You see?
Yeah.
So anyways, and then in the dream state, you don't have this predictability. You don't know if the thing will return. So it does a little bit better with this. The other problem with idealism is solipsism. So solipsism is the belief that only the self exists. Everything goes on in your mind, in your own mind. Reality is in your own mind. So not only do we were talking about in representative realism that you're in a theater and you're locked off from the real world, and so the only thing you're really experiencing is the theater. But now we have private theaters. Lydia has her own theater, you have your own theater, I have my own theater, and those theaters don't necessarily interact.
Right.
That would be the solipsism perspective. And the problem with idealism is it can lead to that. And why would that be not a tenable perspective? If we all have our own worlds that we're living in, we're actually not all living in the same world. We're all living in our own worlds that are all in our own minds, essentially. What's wrong with this idea? Or is this fine? Is this idea fine? Solipsism.
I think solipsism is fine.
You think solipsism is fine? So then, what if we decide if solipsism is fine, then in my world, I am just going to, for no reason, I'm going to make Mao Yushen fail the class in my own world. Okay?
Yeah.
Is that fine?
It's not funny.
Why?
Because
Because we have a relationship with others.
I know, but what if in my world I don't need to have a relationship with him?
That's fine.
So, right?
Yes.
What do you think? Is that okay?
the solipsism.
Yeah, you see? Because this is what solipsism would do. It would be, in my world, maybe I don't want any dogs to exist, so I'm just going to go around and start killing all the dogs.
So no, that's not okay.
Yeah, it's not okay, right?
Yeah, solipsism.
Yeah, so
Because
solipsism,
you have a relation with some people.
because there must be more than just one mind, right? There has to be at least there's more than one mind. Maybe we can't prove that there is other things actually exist and aren't just a fantasy or whatever, or that they don't exist when I don't see them. But at least we have to agree that there's other minds out there. There's other entities out there, and they also have their own ideas, and so we have to interact with those. If it's all just in my mind, it's just my dream, it's just everything me, then I can do whatever I want, right?
Right.
And somehow that doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem correct.
Yes.
Yeah. So we might not even be able to explain why that is, but we know for a fact that solipsism will lead to something horrible. It'll lead to me. So normally, solipsism is actually what we would call a kind of mental insanity. Because there are people that live that way. They think they're really the only thing that exists, and they go and do really horrible things, right? And this, we all know this doesn't lead to a good society. So that's the problem with solipsism. So, so you never be able to. We know. So again, this is socially wrong. You can't do anything socially wrong in solipsism, but we know that people do things that are socially wrong. We know that deep down inside we cannot live this way, and that why do we get embarrassed? Well, if I'm in my own world, why do I ever get embarrassed or shamed? Right? If it's just within my own world, it seems very contradictory of itself. So the simplest explanation. It doesn't seem that idealism gives us the simplest explanation. Why are all these objects, perceived entities, so easy to arrange into physical objects? Why is it then, if all these entities are just perceptions and they don't actually exist in the real world, why is it so easy to say these are all cell phones, and these are all desks, and and to actually categorize them into this time and space? So the simplest explanation of why my guitar is still leaning against the wall when I wake up in the morning, and that no one has moved, borrowed, or stolen it, and it has continued to exist and perceived throughout the night, is that exactly that no one has actually moved it, and nobody's stolen it or borrowed it, and that seems like a more simple explanation than have to explain, that it's just because when I don't see it, it's not there, and when I see it, it is there. So then there's another school of thought called phenomenalism. And phenomenalists, like idealists, think that we only interact with our mental representations of objects, but also think that physical objects can be described purely in terms of patterns of actual and possible sense experience. Phenomenalists believe that all descriptions of physical objects can be translated into descriptions of actual or hypothetical sense experiences. Here's some criticisms of phenomenalism. It's difficult to describe from purely experiential perspective anything, actually. So if you just take something and you try to just talk about your experience with that thing, it's actually very difficult to actually come up with a description. Another problem is solipsism. You will also, in phenomenalism, end up in a solipsistic system. Wittgenstein had the best argument, probably, against phenomenalism, and he calls it the private language argument. So in this argument, he starts with language having rules. All languages have some sort of rules of grammar. And these rules can be checked. So you can check and you can say, okay, that person did make sense when they spoke. What was the pattern of their grammar? And then you look at the pattern of their grammar and you're like, well, that's the reason why, is they didn't follow the rules of the grammar. And you can check this. So how would a phenomenalist check that a red sensation is the same color as the other colors he or she has labeled red? How would you know that this red color is the same as that red color? You have no way of actually checking. But we're able to do that because we have a way to talk to other people about it, and we have an interaction with other people. It's not just in our own heads. We have to verify. We have to have other outside things that tell us that, and that we connected to. With a phenomenalist perspective, you're only having this conversation in your own head, and so there's no way to really verify something with the outside world. And so you could just be talking about all the same. They could actually be all the same color. You wouldn't know when. It would be randomly, like at the red light. If you didn't know the order, because obviously they come in an order, but let's say they always change the order. Usually it's red at the top, green at the bottom, right? But maybe they always change the order. One time you think the light is red, one time you think it's green. There's no way to verify that. So there's no way of checking, since there is little difference between thinking something is red and it actually being red. Here's another question. How do you check the arrival of an airplane? What do you do when you check the arrival of an airplane? Like, how do you know when the airplane has arrived or not?
The pilot will report like we arrived at the destination of which city.
Right.
The ground time is kind of the
right.
Temperature is what, so I will check the arrival.
Right. They'll report it, and you can usually check it online. They'd have some sort of table. They usually, even if they don't report it ahead of time, they give you a time that it's going to come. Now the time could change, but I would always, if I want to verify that when the train arrives or when the plane arrives, maybe a train is better because
the plane just hit the ground and just land at the ground, so the plane will arrive.
Yeah.
Or the plane just stop going anymore.
Well, let's say for example, let's use a train, because it's actually, trains are going to be more consistent than planes, but they can also change the schedule. But let's just say I told you to come and pick me up at the train station at 10:40. Okay. Now, if you could remember that, right, and that's fine. But let's say you wanted to check. You want to check that the time I said was 10:40. What would you do to check?
The arrival time is 10:40.
Yeah.
So going to searching.
You'd go search. You'd search like what we call a timetable. Okay, and that could be online, it could be somewhere else, but you'd want to find some outside. What I'm trying to point to is you need some outside verification in order to know for sure. Now you can just use your head and your memory, but nobody would use their memory to check against their memory. The only way to check your memory is to check an answer, right? You can't just use your memory to check your memory. Or for example, if Lydia, maybe she has something she told you, okay? So you can check with your own mind and remember it, or you can come back to Lydia and ask her, did you say this? And she can tell you. The problem with phenomenalism, it's like just checking things in your own mind. It's like having a train schedule, but you have to check the train schedule in your own mind. You have no way of checking the outside world, the train schedule outside of your mind. It's just all in your mind. So you would never really know when anything actually, for sure, anything. So that seems untenable. It seems untenable that we don't know anything with any kind of certainty. Maybe we can't be certain about anything, but or we can't be too certain about things. But it seems that we have some degree of certainty. So we can't be completely. Again, it's kind of showing that skepticism to some degree runs itself into the ground. Causal realism is our next kind of realism, and this is the one that Warburton tends to think is the most plausible. Causal realism is that our senses and perceptions have a direct influence over our beliefs. They cause our beliefs. Causal realism takes as its starting point the observation that the main biological function of our senses is to help us find our way around the environment. Like representative realism and common sense realism, things exist without a perceiver. But perceiving is then considered information gathering. It doesn't take into account what it's actually like to be perceiving something. So this is a criticism. And a huge metaphysical assumption is that there really is a real world that exists without anything perceiving it. But that assumption could be a positive for you if you already are attracted to the ideal of realism. And if you're not, if you're an idealist, then causal realism will actually not seem that great. And again, Warburton is kind of in favor of this idea. He thinks it's the best theory for perception. It doesn't mean it is, but this is what Warburton at least says. So a couple of questions, and we might not be able to answer these right here, but what do you think Charles Sanders Peirce's theory of perception was? So this would require that you actually do the readings and watch the videos for the Pragmatism 1 at least. Okay? So you need to, these are things to be thinking about. I'll leave these up here for you to think about, and we can talk about them later. And then what is the difference between causal realism and scholastic realism? So scholastic realism is actually dealing with something different than causal realism. I don't know if you remember us talking about scholastic realism at the beginning of the course, but scholastic realism deals more with the problem of universals. It's dealing with abstract entities. Things such as mathematics and geometry, as well as more difficult problems such as what is humanness? Is humanness something that's universal or not? Is redness something that is universal or not? And maybe things like human rights or virtues. Are those real or not? Causal realism has something to do with the physical reality. It's not as much a theory of metaphysics as it is a theory of actual, I guess it is a theory of metaphysics, but it's not dealing with universals per se. It's dealing with case by case points of our interaction with everyday physical realities, and that there's a causation that happens in our brains to cause us to believe something about things, and as we accept those beliefs, then we interact with things perhaps in a more, that's how we come to understand what things actually are, through those beliefs. That's all I'm gonna say for now on these topics. We can have more discussion, and of course I invite you to ask me questions concerning this. With this top question, of course, I think we need to think more about is, what does Charles Sanders Peirce have to say about perception? I think it's a little bit too complicated to get into right now, but I think it's similar to causal realism, believing in a real world that exists, and it also in a way that it interacts with us, causing us to have beliefs, and as we continue to interact, we tend to refine our beliefs. Okay, well, that's everything for today's lecture.